Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wider Angle. In this episode, we will speak about some challenges to liberal democracy and about new sort of dictatorships as they survive, or some might argue thrive in the 21st century. To help us understand those important political and societal challenges, I am joined by Daniel Treisman, a professor of political science at the University of California, Los Angeles, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and the co-authored with Sergei Guriev of Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. Thank you for joining me on the Wider Angle. Welcome.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Dictators have been changing. That is how you start your book. Before we explain how they have changed, tell us, please, how you and your co-author came to this subject and then realization of mutated dictatorships.
Well, Sergei Guriev, my co-author, is a Russian economist, and in the mid-2000s, he was head of an economics university in Moscow, and we were both following the evolution of the Putin regime in Russia. I got to know Sergei through conferences, meetings in Moscow and elsewhere. And we wanted to understand just how this Putin regime operated. And we very quickly saw, both of us, that the kind of techniques that he was using, his basic approach, was in many ways similar to what other non-democratic leaders around the world were doing. So, for instance, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan. There were a whole set of things that these dictators were doing, which were not totally original, but rather different from the classic modus operandi of dictators in the 20th century. So we became interested in studying what seemed to be to us an emerging model of dictatorship. And we collected data, we tried to understand the details of each of these regimes, and we ended up, writing some academic articles and then this book in which we try to sum up what we think we've learned.
So traditional autocracy did not disappear. Tell us, what is the difference then between the classic tyrants of the 20th century and a new model which arose toward the end of the last century, right? What explained this change as well?
Yeah. Well, in the book, we distinguish between two types of dictators. So first of all, the classic 20th century dictator. And of course, this variation over time, but the dominant image of dictatorship in the 20th century was of regimes that were very violent. If we think about Hitler or Stalin or Mao, they each imprisoned and killed millions of people. They censored all media and imposed an official ideology. But even if we look at the non-totalitarian dictators of the 20th century, even leaders like Pinochet or Mobutu or Idi Amin, these were brutally repressive leaders. And they weren't just repressive, they were very public about their violence. They wanted to scare people. That was the point. So often they held public executions. They boasted about their brutality. And this was essential to the model. So we call these dictators fear dictators. And I should say they haven't completely disappeared. So we see fear dictators in Syria, Bashar Assad, in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, for instance. But in the last few decades, the typical non-democratic leader looks a bit different. So if you think about somebody like Hugo Chavez or Viktor Orban, or the leaders in Singapore, or the early Putin. Putin has changed since then, but the early Putin, these guys wear expensive suits. They don't They don't pretend to be military leaders or thugs. They pretend to be very sophisticated. They send their kids to school in the West. They claim to be democratic. They hold elections. They allow some opposition media so long as the audience remains small. And they're much more open to the outside world than many 20th century dictators. Of course, it's an act. They monopolize power like the old dictators, eliminating any effective checks and balances, but they do it without much violence. By manipulating information, by co-opting the media, presenting a distorted version of reality. So instead of terrorizing people into submission, they fool them.
And you also acknowledge that this is not an entirely new model, but that it was the balance that has shifted, and as has the spectrum of dictatorships. So how does the situation look today? Is it that a quarter are also hybrid cases in terms of autocrats since 1945? What are we looking at today?
Right. Well, in the book, and in some journal articles, we try to come up with a way of measuring, distinguishing the different types based on the extent of political violence, political prisoners, political killings, and so on, as well as repression of the media, allowing opposition in elections. And so we came up with some rules of thumb, and we can classify the non-democratic regimes. We have a data set that classifies them since 1946 up until 2015. And what we see is really notable change over time. So as of 2015, more than 40% of leaders in non-democratic states were what we call spin dictators, compared to 20% that were fear dictators. And the rest were, as you said, hybrids with some features of each. If we look at, and we tend to focus on cohorts of leaders based on when the leaders came to power. So if we look across the decades, across the cohorts of leaders, there's been a big increase in spin dictatorship. So the cohort of leaders that came to power in the 2000s, among them, more than 50% are spin dictators under our heuristic. That's up from about 10% in the 1970s cohort, the leaders that came to power in the 1970s. So big increase over the last 50 years.
I want to talk about this idea of the informed groups of people, as you call them in a book, in societies. Who are these members and why are they important? Why are they, the spin dictators, big? Why are they troublesome for them?
Yeah. Well, if we think about why some of these dictators succeed and why some fail, right? So all authoritarian leaders want to concentrate power and remove checks and balances and so on. So why do some of those who seek to control the media, distort the news, manipulate information, and monopolize power succeed while others fail? We think this comes down to the strength of resistance. And we see a highly educated, internationally connected, sophisticated society as the crucial defense. That means journalists, lawyers, civic activists, civil servants, academics, and many others who have the skills to communicate and organize to resist a would-be dictator. And we call people with that kind of human capital and resources, organizational skills, and so on, we call them the informed. It's just kind of a label to talk about this group in society, although it's very heterogeneous. Okay, so it's not necessarily the rich who are members of this group. It's, to say it very simply, it's those who are harder to fool.
Mm-hmm.
Those who are more difficult to manipulate and who have the skills and the networks to fight back. And we think ultimately the reason why some would be authoritarian leaders, and I would include in that group our former president, President Trump, the reason ultimately why they fail is because they come up against this sophisticated, internationally connected, skilled part of society, which organizes to fight back. And countries obviously differ in the preparation, first of all, the extent of that part of society, and then the preparation and ability to fight back, using the institutions, using the tools at their disposal to prevent this kind of concentration of power.
While you were talking, it just came to my mind how the very title informed, as objective as it factual as it might be, might reflect in a very conspiratorial leaning societies or reinforce a paranoia against spies. So when we speak about these informed groups of people, that idea might just be, oh, of course they are informed, but by this security agency or by these sort of enemies as well. So it's very complicated how additional challenges can accumulate for this group of people who might just be doing their job or wanting to organize in the face of the challenges that you described. It's really difficult in particular circumstances, which leads me to my question. So you write in the book, when the facts are good, they take credit for them. When bad, they have the media obscure them when possible and provide excuses when noted. Poor performance is the fault of external condition or enemies, like we just mentioned. And disappointing outcomes are cast as still better than others could achieve. My question is this: how to reconcile, though, the fact that with large swaths of population and citizen in this sort of context, as you acknowledge in your book, they really like their ruler, their leader, and how to reach those partisan zealots who seem to be following these rulers no matter what. I mean, this cognitive dissonance is so difficult to deal with in this sort of situation, despite the informed groups of people. So what do we do with that?
It's very difficult from the outside to destroy the popularity of a popular authoritarian leader. Fortunately, they often destroy it themselves over time, but it's very difficult from outside. And I didn't mean to suggest that that it's ultimately based on just facts, and that by presenting some facts from the outside, we can just pop the bubble. The part of what we were really interested in pinning down was why people in that position have turned out to be so effective. Because we tend to think about the media as being, if a leader who lives in an environment which includes some opposition media, which doesn't close the borders against the internet, against international contacts, and so on, we tend to think that it's very difficult for a leader like that to hypnotize the whole country into believing things that aren't true. And what I think a lot of people are realizing more and more is it is difficult, but it's not at all impossible. And to convince people of something, one doesn't need to completely silence the critics. One can discredit them, or one can marginalize them. And if one uses emotion as well as facts, and makes it comfortable for people to believe that the dictator is a great leader, an effective leader, a modern leader, then people will do the work themselves. They won't question messages that make them basically feel comfortable, proud, and so on. And I think we're realizing that those forces can be very powerful when managed in a sophisticated way. And we've seen this series of leaders doing exactly that. So I think this is a model which will continue.
The question about spin dictators switching back to fear dictators seems quite pertinent, for example, after observing Putin's actions during ongoing invasion of Ukraine, compared to mostly nonviolent methods that he first used to consolidate power. I really appreciated your explanation in one foreign affairs article, which was published a few months ago. And I think that you have a new edition in which you delve into more details, this sort of questions that came probably after the publication of the book. So one thing that I would kindly ask you to elaborate is this, which I thought was very important, and that is that, as you write, to understand why Putin chose overt repression over manipulation at this point requires a sense of how his regime's internal composition has changed over time. I don't say, and you can tell us more, that that's the only reason, but knowing some other contexts as well, I think it's very valuable argument that I would like to elaborate a little bit more on. Can you tell us about that in Putin's case at the moment as we were speaking about it?
Sure. But I should say in general, first of all, that it is something that happens, that has happened a number of times, that a spin dictator at a certain point gives up on the model. Perhaps they're under pressure because of economic crisis, or perhaps for other reasons. And or the public, the informed are just doing too well and threatening his regime. So he then reverts to the tactics of fear dictatorship and more overt repression. We saw that in Turkey with Erdogan after the attempted coup of 2016. We've seen that in Venezuela with the shift from strategy of Hugo Chavez to the techniques of Nicolas Maduro, much more brutal. And we see it in Putin. So Putin really started out in the early 2000s as one of the pioneers, one of the masters of this model of spin dictatorship. Over time, he's changed. And since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the regime in Russia has become a really brutal, archaic kind of authoritarian regime. So why did that happen? Well, I think the story of Putin is a story of progressive narrowing. So in his thinking, there've always been a number of different elements. And those were, in a sense, mirrored by different groups in his entourage. So at the beginning, among his advisors, he had economic liberals, he had political technocrats, he had the security service people, often old friends from St. Petersburg and other periods in his career. And so he had those three groups with very different views of the world, very different priorities, understandings. And he benefited from the contrasts between their advice. He balanced them against each other and so on. Over time, I think he lost faith in the first two groups. So the liberal, Western-oriented economists, I think one key reason why he started pushing them aside and listening to them less was that they continually told him that if he didn't do something serious about corruption, if he put businessmen like Mikhail Khodorkovsky in jail, if he allowed his cronies to expropriate assets from Russian companies, then the markets would crash. And they didn't. He arrested Khodorkovsky, put him in jail, and in subsequent years, the stock market soared. So I think he lost faith in some of the messages they were sending him, although he's always been very worried about inflation and has been quite conservative in macroeconomic policy. He still has Elvira Nabiullina in the central bank, who's a very careful, orthodox economic technocrat. The second group were the political operatives that managed the elections for him, that made this spin model work in practice. People like Gleb Pavlovsky and Vladislav Surkov. And I think he lost faith in them in part when in 2011, 2012, he comes back to the Kremlin and there's this burst of massive uh, anti-Kremlin demonstrations, anti-Putin demonstrations, demonstrations against falsification of elections. And this comes as a shock, and it suggests to him that the political operatives are not able to cope with society, Russian society. And he more and more turns to his old security service friends and allows them to use the methods that they're comfortable with and they think are effective. So it's none of this is instantaneous. It plays out over 20 years as his approach develops. But he ends up with this very narrow group of advisors, and I think that's mirrored by a very narrow mindset, which is increasingly nationalist, as we see with the sort of crazy belief in a kind of ethnic destiny for Russia.
Russian world, Ruski mir.
Ruski mir, all that, and the idea that this kind of 19th century empire can be recreated. So he ends up surrounded by a few people who believe in that, very few people who will argue against that sort of idea, and a very conspiratorial outlook, it seems, based on just about everything he says these days. A view of the West in which it's all about conspiracy and attempts to undermine him and to destroy Russia. So I think that's how we get to the point where he's now engaged fully with well, I should say not fully. Sadly, there's even further that he could go. He hasn't put tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of political prisoners in jail at this point, though the numbers have gone up. He hasn't engaged in massive political killing. And we should remember that in the 20th century, many dictatorships were killing thousands, tens of thousands of their own citizens. Thank God we're not there. So there is unfortunately still room that he could go, but it's very much a regime based on fear, based on intimidation, based on conformity. And it's no longer a regime that's really based on pretending to be democratic and liberal and competent and internationally respected. We're in a new world here.
And you do mention in another, I think it was Foreign Affairs, probably in your book as well, about some of two key defects about Putin, and that's also his political command structure, a little bit that you mentioned here as well, that he built over the past 22 years in terms of both vertical power and the need to continually project strength. And I think that that's applicable in some other context as well. I am interested in this argument that I think, again, is not emphasized enough in the conversations about this topic. So I'm very curious, and I would welcome your elaboration of this. The fact that you just say it is easy to mistake spin dictators for illiberal democracies, that is, democracies in which freely elected governments fail to protect civil rights and discriminate against minorities. Why do you think it's important, as you argue, that we should just understand that spin dictators are not democrats at all?
So there are illiberal democracies and there are pseudo-democracies, and spin dictators are really pseudo-democrats, not illiberal democrats. So what is an illiberal democracy? Well, an illiberal democracy is a democracy where you see tyranny of the majority, as Tocqueville called it. You have a government that's elected fair and square, that's supported by the majority, but that doesn't respect the rights of minorities, that ignores the preferences of minorities. So in many ways, we see something like that in India under Modi, which has become a strongly anti-Muslim regime. It's possible that India could also, that Modi might also start using techniques of spin dictatorship, weakening the judiciary, manipulating the media in a way that would undermine the legitimacy and the validity of elections in India. But we definitely see illiberalism in the kind of policies, but illiberalism that seems to be supported by a majority. So it's not necessarily undemocratic in a very simple minimalist definition. But spin dictators, it's not that they get elected fair and square and then adopt policies that may be illiberal. The elections themselves that bring them to power and that confirm their power are manipulated and based on distorted information. So I think we need to distinguish these things. Spin dictators benefit from an image, both at home and abroad, of being democratic politicians. And we need to recognize when they do rig the electoral environment to the extent that it calls into question the results, that they are no longer really Democrats at all.
You do also document the spread of spin dictators and describe the methods they use to stay in power, and don't downplay the fact that some Western politicians have tried what many people fear. You do acknowledge that threat that Western democracies might sink into spin? Or what do you say actually to those who tell you or ask you that that's the way and that's the road that Western democracy is going to? Why do more democracies not slide into spin dictatorship?
I think we come back to this part of society that we call the informed. When there's a challenger who wants to erode democracy in order to consolidate his own power, what stops him in some cases is the actions of the journalists, the judges, the civil servants, the NGO activists, academics, large parts of society that in different interconnected ways just block such attempts to undermine the political system. And we see that process. I mean, nothing in the future is certain. Trump is going to run in 2024, but we saw that process working in the US. And I'm not saying there's any reason for nonchalance. There were some close calls. But to the extent that democracies survive against very effective would-be spin dictators, it's because of the kind of resistance that you get in a highly modern, globalized society. But that requires action. And we need to remember that democracy, like happiness, is not a passive state. It's an activity. And if the informed don't defend democracy, then there's no reason to be confident that it will survive. On the other hand, I think sometimes we get a little bit too alarmed at threats to democracy in the developed Western cases, because we tend to think that it must be unselfish, altruistic acts to defend democracy that are needed to protect it, or it must be a deep understanding of democracy among ordinary people. And I don't think those are really what democracy's survival depend on. I think what it depends on is the often self-interested actions of opposition and independent forces in society, defending their own interests, and in the process, acting out the game of democracy and constraining an actor who would like to undermine or erode those processes. And I think we can have we should feel some satisfaction that in the most advanced democracies, even when they throw up some kind of dangerous populist politician, as many have in recent years, that itself leads to the kind of actions. It stimulates the resistance that those societies contain.
At the same time, what do you say to those who ask, will this last? Or what do the potential outcomes depend on? Is it just the actions and resistance, or is it also how these dictatorships came to be? What are the factors besides the modernization cocktail, as you write in your book, that we should look into going forward?
I think we need to look into that. So what we call the modernization cocktail is really a combination of economic modernization, social modernization, and globalization, with various elements that interact. So in a sense, the whole world, even if some parts of the world are moving more slowly, others faster, there's a global process driven by modernization that constrains dictators in different parts of the world. And I'm thinking of the global internet, international communications, international media, global human rights movement, for instance, which I think emerged from democratization in the most economically advanced countries, and then these processes that take off horizontally around the world. We need to worry if that process reverses. And many people have started to talk about perhaps even an end to modernization, economic development, perhaps a reversal of globalization. We've clearly seen a plateau in international trade, international ties of various kinds, in the COVID period with the new war. And even before that, there was clear slowing of global increases in global integration. I don't see any reason to assume that we're going back into an era of protection like the 1930s and autarky or anything like that. But to the extent that we no longer have these pressures driven by economic modernization in different countries, to the extent that the international human rights movement and international media are weakened, then the pressures on dictators to adapt, to first of all pretend to be democrats and adopt spin dictatorship, and ultimately to transition into some other more open kind of political regime, those pressures will get weaker. So I think we need to look at the global, not so much the global measures of democracy, because I think those are a bit misleading. We've kind of changed our definitions as we're measuring the trends. But we do need to look at global trends in economic development, in trade, and in these international institutions. I should say, another thing which is perhaps a little bit more positive than one might think at times is that the international human rights regime, the set of UN treaties and other agreements on human rights, has not crumbled in the last 10 years. Very few countries have withdrawn from those human rights treaties, and new countries have been signing them. We've seen really a quite inspiring increase in the use of open source information to intelligence to document war crimes, and we don't yet know what the impact of that is going to be in the case of Ukraine, but it's a positive development. We've seen the use of things like the Magnitsky List and many countries' Magnitsky List, singling out individuals who violate human rights for international sanctions. And we've seen the movement of extraterritorial jurisdiction, allowing judges in one country to indict and sometimes prosecute people for war crimes in other countries. So there is this process associated with globalization of the spread of democratic and liberal institutions that hasn't crumbled or very clearly reversed, even though we've been paying a lot of attention to the more alarming parts of the picture.
I think this will be very helpful to a lot of people who are struggling and putting their efforts into this, to hear this sort of injection of optimism despite the acknowledgement of these threats. In terms of what the West, in terms of Western policy, you described two approaches that have dominated Western policy towards dictators since World War II. But for current challenges, you suggest an approach of so-called adversarial engagement. What would that look like, or what does that look like?
Right. So simplifying a lot, we say that the West has really had these two approaches to dictatorship since 1945. First of all, containment, the key policy of the Cold War era, and then a kind of simplistic, perhaps, embrace of integration. So complete integration of authoritarian countries. And we argue that we need to do things a little bit differently. And what we suggest is what we call, as you said, adversarial engagement. So first of all, we don't think, some people think that the West can just decouple from the authoritarian world, from China, from Russia, from other countries with autocratic governments. We don't think that's possible. And it could be counterproductive if it were. So pandemics, technological discoveries, many other things are going to continue to cross borders. And if the West disengages, then other parts of the world will end up calling the shots, leading global developments. So we think we need to remain engaged. There's going to be trade with China. There's going to be trade with authoritarian countries. We need to remain engaged, but we need to do it in a smarter and in some ways more defensive way than in the past. So what do we mean? Well, we need to monitor better all the interactions between the West and the authoritarian world. That means better financial monitoring, counterintelligence, cybersecurity, and so on. All these different aspects we need to make investments, we need to improve these. We need to build resilience, so identify vulnerabilities in supply chains. We need to think about the trade patterns. Even as we continue to trade, we need to make sure there's some redundancy and make sure that the pattern of trade doesn't create vulnerabilities that can be exploited on our side. We need to stop enabling dictators. So we've been remarkably tolerant in the US and in Europe of whole industries of support for authoritarians around the world. So I'm thinking of lobbyists who help authoritarian leaders influence policy in the West, lawyers who set up shell companies, who help dictators evade taxes or just conceal their wealth. Journalists sometimes work to spread the message of foreign dictators. High-tech firms, I think, first of all, have been selling tools to dictators that are then used for surveillance of their populations and intimidation of their populations. And I think the tech companies have not done as much as they could have to develop the kind of technologies that would really liberate populations in authoritarian countries and enable them to resist dictatorship. So I think the tech companies need to do more than they have. Okay, stop enabling dictators. We also need to reform and strengthen international institutions. Often these are exploited by the authoritarian governments. This is a classic move of spin dictators to become a member some Western liberal institution, and then just to exploit it to blackmail partners. We've seen Orban in Hungary joining the EU, and then continuing to get these large subsidies, which are then used in murky ways. We see Russia using Interpol to try and harass critics of the regime around the world. So we need to, in some cases, reorganize and change the rules within these international institutions so that they're not exploited by dictators. So those are the main ideas. There are various other elements to this, but we need to remain engaged, but we need to do so in a way which doesn't make us more vulnerable than our partners, and that doesn't end up empowering the authoritarian forces within those countries.
And so at the end of each conversation, I ask the guest about the wider angle of the work or story in question. So what is the wider angle of not just spin dictatorships in terms of the challenges they pose, but also that aspect of the West needing to put its political house in order as well? What's the wider angle here?
Right. Well, I think, yeah, in order to defeat dictatorship of all kinds, especially spin dictatorship, but other kinds as well, Western democracies have to be an inspiring model that other states choose to follow. And yeah, under the heading adversarial engagement, we also think a very important aspect is cleaning up democracies in the West so that they don't deserve a bad reputation, which unfortunately in some places they have been getting. So I think we have to recognize that there's a global competition of ideas. Ultimately, it comes down to this competition of ideas. And that should be an easy competition to win, because the idea of liberal democracy remains extremely attractive around the world. So if you ask people around the world what kind of regime they would like to live under, the vast majority in almost all countries chooses democracy. And you can break it down into different elements: free elections, liberal freedoms, and so on. There's very strong support, even stronger support in authoritarian countries often than in actual democracies, for liberal democracy. But at the same time, people have become doubtful about incumbents in many democracies. There's this rhetoric of opposition to the elites. There's a suspicion that the stewards of the current system in the Western democracies are not always as competent and benevolent as one might wish. There's this sense of hypocrisy that the interests of the rich are often camouflaged as the public interest. And I think there's a lot of frustration in Western democracies because the constraints of this new global order mean that governments within a nation state can't always choose different policies. So you can have a party on the left, a party on the right, but they're basically forced in some respects, to adopt a similar policy. So they all have to worry about capital flight. They all have to worry about or recognize the basic structural constraints. And that leads to a lot of frustration. So it looks like, if the left and the right are both saying that we can't raise the tax rate that much, they start to look hypocritical, and you start to suspect some conspiracy between these different flavors of elite. So there's this dissatisfaction, I think, in the West and in many developing countries where the regime is kind of teetering between democracy and authoritarianism. There's this discontent with the elites of the West. And I think we need to recognize that. We need to address it in part with the sort of things that I was mentioning in the context of stopping empowering dictators. We need to reform our own democracy to make it more open, more honest. And I think if we do that, then we'll very easily win the competition, because nobody really wants to live in a regime like China. When China was growing extremely fast, I think we're headed into a period of slower growth in the authoritarian world. But when China was growing very fast, that was attractive. But as the growth rate in China slows down, I think perhaps leaders in some countries would like to have the Chinese model. It's a model of authoritarian order, but the populations of most countries don't want to live in a system run by a party of princelings or who will lock people in their apartments for months on end, prevent COVID spreading. There's a real lack of human concern in the authoritarian regimes, obviously, and I think people recognize that. People want as much freedom as they can have, along with competent leadership and rule of law. So I think we're in this competition of ideas. I think we could win it. I think it shouldn't be hard to win it. But at this point in time, that requires some reform, that requires some rethinking, and that requires a lot of honesty and international cooperation too. So I guess that's a pretty wide angle
It's a pretty wide angle.
for
Yeah.
global a recipe for what the world needs to do to change. Of course, all this is very easy to say, but very hard to do.
I encourage everyone to read Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. And I really appreciate your time, Daniel Treisman, for sharing these insights and contributing to the conversation about the challenges that are ongoing in different societies across the world. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
To everyone else, stay tuned for more conversations with people from all over the globe. Have a good day. Bye.